A warm welcome to Stories of Resilience with Writing Relations. This is a series where we meet with people from different walks of life who will share their valuable experiences, wisdom, and reflections on what is needed to build a better path towards a heart-led radical social change. So my name is Miriam Sanawap, and so I am the member of the Writing Relations for the West Hub. And so this year, 2023, is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights. So, however, like we see, there's still many struggles that continue to confront our local and global communities. While we have international human rights law and foundation to guide us, we have a long way to go to actualize these rights and bring peace to our communities and world. The rates of hate and intolerance are growing, poverty is deepening, and Canadians are only now beginning to reckon with our deep history of genocide. So in our commitment to advance human rights globally, from December 1st to the 10th of 2023, the John Humphrey Center for Peace and Human Rights, in partnership with Writing Relations, will host Ignite Change, a global convention that will host a series of online and in-person events to bring together civic society, academics, and decision makers in dialogue, learning, and action on human rights. These 10 days will profile and facilitate public discourse on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its 75th anniversary, as well as strengthen collective action and commitment to advance human rights. So, Writing Relations is a growing national network that strives to support and build capacity amongst adult educators and community organizers to provide space and resources for them to connect and reflect on and organize for heart-led social change and to build a just Canada. So if you're interested in learning more, please check out our YouTube channel. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. And so today we have our guest with us, which I'll introduce her. Her name is Jo-Ann Saddleback, is a member of the Saddleback Cree Nation, First Nation. And her husband, Jerry Saddleback, is from the Samson Cree Nation, and they have 11 children between them. And Jo-Ann worked as a policy analyst and researcher for various organizations and executive director for Metis Settlements General Council, heading up legal and governmental affairs. And she also spent 30 years as a community developer, traveling across Canada, developing and delivering workshops for RCMP, Corrections Canada, and Alberta Health and Alberta Justice. As part of this work, she visited old people in First Nations and Metis community. They initiated her to ceremonies and evaluated the teachings she shares in communities. So Jo-Ann remains grateful. They entrusted her to continue work, sharing their wisdom. So, Jo-Ann, I'm going to ask you a few questions. One of the first questions that I'll ask you, so how did you come into being a human rights defender?
First, I'm going to have to ask the library to take down that bio. It talks about stuff that I did like 30 years ago. It's got nothing current on it right now. It doesn't talk about the community work that I do now or anything about, my work with the Edmonton Public Library or with the Canadian Research Institute on Substance Misuse or in the art community, that I'm so involved in now. So I have to change that. And how did I become in human rights? I think that it was probably, on my way to school, living in St. Paul de Métis with my family and having, being 5 years old and having non-Indigenous kids, from the French community throw rocks at me. And I realized that even though I did not understand the difference at that time, that something about me was different. It was different to other people. There was something going on that I didn't quite understand. It was probably the first time that I understood and was aware of racism, and that somebody didn't think that I belonged in that school. And I cannot believe that it came from those children themselves. Although children can be bullies, I don't understand why I would be specifically their victim. And it just may have been coincidence, but it really brought a lot to me. And I understood that there was this kind of violence in the world. There was this kind of unprovoked and illogical kind of hatred or violence and bullying, that was going on in the world. So that was the first of it. I didn't speak to my parents about it immediately, but I began to understand, how can I look after myself? What am I going to do to survive this? And, when you're 5 years old, that's all you want to do. I have to go to school. I'm forced to go to school. I must. Something I have to do, to walk a different route, try to befriend somebody that I can walk with. But I never did. I never did tell my parents. Never did. My father, he was a carpenter. My mother, he was a carpenter from Kikino Metis Settlement. My mother, she was, I would say probably at that time, a housekeeper. And she was from Saddleback Cree First Nations. And from both of them, he moved us into Edmonton because there was very little work in St. Paul. Back then, it was a very small town. It's really grown since then, but back then it was very small. And my parents had the attitude that we're on a mission, and we may not accomplish everything that we need to or want to in our lifetime, but the very best that we can do is to leave our children a legacy of good work. And that's what they both did in their very society impacting ways, both of them. My father, he was a functional illiterate. He had a grade 6 education, and he grew up in the rough, tough streets of St. Paul de Metis and then Kikino. And my mother, she was a survival of residential school. She had a grade 8 education. And you have to understand that in residential schools, a grade 8 education doesn't mean that she's getting an academic education or even a trade skill education. They were training our young people to be housekeepers, and not janitors, but janitor helpers. They were not given any vocational training, and they were certainly not given an academic training. And grade 8 was all she could hope to accomplish education-wise, because no further education were given First Nations people or Métis people at that time. So it's amazing what they accomplished in their lives. My mother, she was a devout Catholic, and then something changed in her. She began to, listen to this inner voice, and she remembered all the cultural things of her father and of her mother, and especially this old man who used to come to visit the reserve sometimes. It began to call her. They didn't kill it in her. It didn't go away. She began to recall it. Even in later years, she still went to the occasional mass, like high mass at Christmas time, although for many years she didn't go. Instead, we opted to go to Saddleback and have a midnight sweat on Christmas Eve. But still, occasionally she would go, but she didn't go to just any church either. Of course, it was Sacred Heart Church here in Edmonton. That is a First Nations Catholic church. My father, he had this skill. He was a carpenter, and there was no work for him, or very little work, or maybe he couldn't get work because he was Métis. And he took us to Edmonton. He brought us to Edmonton, and he became a foreman, and he was a strong union member, and he helped to build, of many buildings here in Edmonton, he helped to build the Chateau Lacombe. That's the one I remember most. But he quit that work and he became a union organizer. And he did that. So he knew, he had this sense, even though he had a grade 6 education, he had a great sense about him, a lot of street smarts. And he really knew a lot about the human condition. And it was from there that he knew how to organize people. He knew what moved society. And he said, if you want things to change, you have to change the hearts and minds of people. That's how you make social movement. That's how it becomes successful. And that's when it's effective, when you've moved the hearts and minds of people. I think he knew this very early, and especially when he was working with unions. My mother, I remember, I'm the youngest of 4 daughters, and I had the privilege of staying home with her when my other sisters were in school. And she was the housekeeper of some pretty affluent people. I remember, I think his name was Dr. Rada, and his wife, Mrs. Rada. He was actually her doctor, and that's how she came to know him. And he hired her to do housekeeping and some babysitting for them. And it was they were pretty affluent people. I remember going there and thinking, I have never seen a house like this in my life. And then we go back home to our very little bungalow in Jasper Place at that time. It was its own town. It wasn't part of Edmonton yet. And Edmonton annexed it, I think, in the 1970s or somewhere around there. But that's where she would bring, and we often had boarders with us, even though it was a small place, we would have boarders with us. Mm-hmm. And I remember that awakening in her. It happened when I was in my teen years. And I mentioned my parents because they were great movers of human rights. And they instilled in me how important it was. And something I learned very important from my father is that you only have the rights you exercise. If you do not exercise your rights, if you don't know what your rights are, you will lose them. It's as simple as that. So he said, you must always exercise the rights you have and exercise them fully, or they will be lost. So in this work that he was doing, he became aware. He took a trip up north one time, and he became aware. He was trying to buy something from the Bay, Hudson's Bay store in the north. And what he bought was a pound of sausage. He froze it and he brought it home with him. I imagine that he got, what he needed from there. But what happened was that they were in the early 1960s, like 1965, they were selling a pound of sausage to that community for nearly $3 a pound. And at that time in the 1960s, that was an absolutely outrageous price. And they controlled everything. They had the post office too. So when people's checks came in, they were the banker. They would take their money first, and then they would disperse it, to the people. They just had complete control over those communities. And so my father, him and Johnny Sampson, who was then the chief of the Sampson Reserve in Musqueam, which was formerly Hobbema, little side story about that. Everybody couldn't figure out what kind of Cree word Hobbema was. So they did some research, and it turns out that it's the name of some obscure Dutch artist. And so the four chiefs of the 4 bands there, they decided to go back to the original name, which was Musqueam. It means bare hills. Mm-hmm. Another funny little aside, and I'll get back to it. Get back to the main tale I'm telling here, is that when they did change the name, there is a macron, so an upside down V on top of the last I for Musqueam. That's what gives it its pronunciation. But if you don't put that macron up there, it becomes Musqueam, and that means a bear's bum. So we're laughing, when we go to Musqueam and there's no macron on the name there, and they completely changed it to something else. That becomes very important. That's the identity of that community. That's what children from Musqueamachis are looking at, you know, and it's saying Musqueamachis instead of Musqueamachis. But what they did was that they hitchhiked to Ottawa. It got a lot of media attention at that time. And they got a lot of support for going there. And it was Sausage for PM. And I think it was Lester Pearson, who was the prime minister at that time. And it was to meet him and to talk about what is he going to do to control the outrageous companies that are up north and abusing and taking advantage of the people so terribly. And even now, it happens this way. That, for instance, when I took a 13 isolated communities tour of up north in Fort McPherson in the Arctic Circle, the people told me that when the big trucks came with all of the produce goods up in that community, is that the company who owned, you know, all these groceries and things like that, and the northern store that's up there, they would allow the white teachers and white policemen and, you know, anybody who was white to go and have the pickings first of all the freshest fruit, of all the freshest vegetables. And that's something that still goes on, you know, and then the community people, then they would be allowed to come in. So all of these things still go on, but nobody's talking about it anymore. So what they did was that they hitchhiked to Ottawa, and they did get that meeting with the prime minister, and they were talking about, and he talked back to them, you know, sort of like, this is what I can do. These are our limitations, and there's not a lot of political will to do anything for Indigenous people at that time. So they came back knowing that it was up to them. It was up to them, that they had to find out what their rights were as human beings living in Canada. And they had to find out what obstacles were keeping them from being full citizens or recognized people with full human rights is more like it. And when they came back, it is very strange. The Hudson's Bay Company approached my father, and then he told me this story himself, that when he came back, he had to know, and he took the meeting with the Hudson's Bay administration. He had to know, who were these people? So they took him into their office, and they told him they would give him whatever he wanted. And they presented him with a blank check to just leave it alone, to just leave them alone and walk away. He didn't do that. He knew that some pivotal moment was happening, that there was something really big going on, and he better pay attention, and he better get smart fast if he was going to do anything. Now we lived, the way my father was, is that he would take his dinner, right after dinner, he would take his coffee, and he would lay down on the living room floor, and he had a glass on the living room floor, and he kind of lived on the living room floor. And he had a great big television because he wanted to see that hockey puck. He was a great fan of Canadian hockey. And he was watching the news at one point of it, and there was a commercial that came on about starving children in the world. And if there was anything that could ever undo my father, it would be children suffering. It just completely undid him. I mean, he was one tough guy. And, you know, you always approached him with caution. And in fact, one woman talked about him. They said, either you love him or you hate him, but both are with a passion. And he sat there, and he was always wanting to go out for drives and take a coffee. I mean, there were a few times when he'd tell me, and he named me Jo-Ann, specifically that he could call me Joe. And he's about the only one, maybe two other people in the world who actually call me Joe. and he called me Joe. His father was Joseph. His name was Stanley Joseph. His brother Martin was Martin Joseph, and all the boys, had Joseph in their name. And he called me Joe. And he'd say, "Come on, let's go for a ride." And all of a sudden, we'd be in Jasper. He'd have a cup of coffee and drive back. There was even one time when we took a drive and we ended up someplace in New Mexico. He had his coffee and a meal and drove back. He loved driving. But he was so bothered that night by what he had seen. And he went out for a drive. And he found himself very late at night in a part of Saddle Lake that he never knew. He didn't know where he was. He did see a light on in one of the houses not far from where he had stopped. So he went to that house to ask for directions. And he knocked on the door, and it was Ralph Steinauer. It was his house that he knocked on. Ralph Steinauer is the former Lieutenant Governor of Alberta. And Ralph Steinauer looked at him and he just went, "Stan Daniels." And there was a meeting going on that night with the chief and the band council, and they were trying to figure out, and they had ceremony, they had lifted their pipes, and they were trying to ask, how can they get a hold of Stan Daniels? That's what they were meeting that night about. And there he was. He showed up at their door, lost. He didn't know where in Saddle Lake he was. Couldn't find his way home. 2 months after that, it was the end of Indian agents as we know them in the Indian Affairs Canada. Indian agents, it was their job to disperse what was supposed to come from treaty. All the supplies, rations, the money that were supposed to come to each reserve. And instead of a lot of it getting to the people, Indian agents were hoarding it and reselling it and building their own little empires. And they didn't work or advocate for the people. They worked crookedly, corruptly for the government. So this is what he was dealing with. And this is what the meeting of those leaders was about that evening. And they knew that he was an organizer. They knew that he had brought attention to Indian issues, as what we were called back then, to the forefront, and that people were now paying attention. That's the reason why it was about him that they prayed. They wanted to get a hold of him. And 2 months later, there were marches all across Canada of First Nations people, and they got rid of Indian agents as we know them. Here, they're still Indian agents, but they have none of that kind of power, and they don't get away with half of that. And a lot of their job description has changed since then. So he did that. And he pulled Harold Cardinal out of Carleton University in Ottawa. He got Eugene Steinauer, who used to run around with a tape recorder, recording, interviewing everybody. And he got, what's his name? Cunningham. I can't remember his first name. Oh, that's terrible. But out of Native Counseling Services. And he banded them together. He got them together. And he negotiated the funding. It was the very first time ever on this continent, probably in North and Central and South America, that Indigenous people ever received government funding. And he broke that door open. He bust that door open. That's the reason why there are buildings around Edmonton that carry his name, Stan Daniels. For instance, the Stan Daniels Healing Center and the Stan Daniels Senior Citizens Lodge. And and there used to be, I don't know if it exists anymore, but a Stan Daniels bursary at the University of Alberta. So he did a lot. And for him, it didn't matter if you were First Nations, Metis, or non-Indigenous. If you were in trouble, he helped. I remember so many people, him bringing so many people to the house and saying, you know, to my mother, we have to feed this person. And so he'd feed them and he'd kind of help them get on their feet. And it was in 1967 or 68 that I attended the First Metis Association of Alberta annual assembly. And there were about 68 members at that time. And it took them about 3 years later, and they were over, well, they were close to 10,000. And I remember when they had an annual assembly, they would just simply take over a whole town. They would just take it over. They, you know, and some people were very angry, but I'll tell you, all of the, what do you call them? The business associations, they were really happy. You know, and they may not have liked us and they may not support us in our fight for rights, but they really liked the money coming in when we walked into town.
Yeah, so just to move on to the second question, with the stories that you highlighted for us, like, what are the major learnings that you've had about human rights?
My mother, she was one of the original women who belonged to Indian Rights for Indian Women. She had lost her treaty status and she had married my Métis father. So her, Jenny Margetts, I can't remember all the women. One just died too. She was the last one. I can't remember, from Alberta, and they took the federal government to court, and they won, sort of. They got Bill C-31 out of it. They got their rights back, but they wanted to have their children have their rights back, because the Indian Act, which had nothing to do with treaty, took their rights away. It gave rights to non-Indigenous women who married treaty men. They became treaty and their children became treaty. But when a treaty woman married a non-treaty man, she lost her rights and so did her children. Her children would never enjoy those rights. I once asked my mother, why did you fight so hard? And she told me, she said, I had a right to be buried with my ancestors, and I had a right to give my daughters their inheritance. Because in our Cree way, you inherit from your mother. You are what your mother is. We come from matriarchal societies. So what did I learn? I learned that human rights is not only about who you are and what kind of human rights you have as being an alive person. It also means culture. It also means, how do you understand the world? From what perspective are you going to, and what approaches are you going to use to live your life? And how are those included in the mosaic of this society today? How are you going to get a voice at the table or a say at the table that includes your approaches and what you believe? And we're talking about whole cultures. So we're talking about a whole sector in society of people, you know, in order to be heard. I've sat on many boards, many boards and committees. And I was ever the only Indigenous person on that committee. So you would call me a token. And I did not have the freedom to talk about how we believe, how we would approach this issue, or how we would approach that problem. And I've heard it from other people who sat on committees who are mostly non-Indigenous, and they say the same thing. They think we're stupid. They don't think we have anything to contribute or anything to offer. And worse, they are not willing to listen. And they have no understanding of our philosophies and our beliefs, that they cannot comprehend, they cannot conceptualize what it is that we're talking about, because we have no relationship, none whatsoever. I think my biggest lesson is that I've worked a lot in prisons. I've never worked for prisons, for Corrections Canada, but they have contracted me. And I mostly existed my career in the nonprofit sector. And we would go in and we would share cultural workshops in prisons with the guys. The federal prison system is ruled by gangs, Red Alert, Native Syndicate, Indian Posse, Northside Boys. I mean, it's run by gangs in the federal system. And I'd go into that system and I'd be with these guys locked in a room and me for every day for 5 or 6 days. And one of the things that they taught me, and in this too, they learned a lot as well. It wasn't the first day, it wasn't the second day, but on the third day, they would take all their colors off at the door. Then they'd come in, then they would come in. That's how powerful culture is. It has that kind of profound impact on people, can change their lives, change their whole perspective of the way they view the world and of the universe. But they told me, they said, and they were talking about government. They were saying, yes, my mother, she may have been a prostitute. She may have been a drug addict. She may have been an alcoholic. But where were you, meaning the government, when she needed training, when she needed support, when she needed an education, when she needed a job? Where were you? And they said, we're in here for 2 reasons: poverty and racism. And I learned that those were the heart of human rights in this world. Doesn't matter where you are, that Gandhi was right when he said there's no violence as brutal as poverty is. And then you have racism on top of that. And you force the people to live under that. And you train your children to think of them as stupid as well. So it becomes intergenerational. That kind of hatred, that kind of, racism, and forcing people to live in poverty. So those were my biggest lessons about human rights, and learning them from the most unusual places, I guess you would call it. I didn't realize, and Nexie, she's been so lovely. She's probably sent me all of this information, but I didn't realize that I was answering questions. I thought that I was telling a story. But if you have another question, I won't override your agenda there.
No worries. Yeah, so when you think, okay, since you were talking about young people, this next question actually kind of segues into that. What are the learnings that you think the younger generations of human rights defenders need to know and understand to be effective?
Something else those guys in prisons taught me. They said, you've got these youth programs. They start, 12 to 17 or something like that. And they said, you missed us. You missed us a long time. They said, those pimps and those drug pushers, they're in the playground. So they get us when we're 5 years old. So by the time we're 7, we're already pushing drugs. And what they do is that we are the favorite community to commit crime on, and the favorite community to recruit to commit crime. And they told me that, and how they did it was that they would always dangle in front of a child saying, we know where you live, we know who your parents are, we know who your sisters and brothers are, and you don't do what we say, and we are going to hurt them. Don't do what we say. That includes recruiting your sisters to become prostitutes for us and get involved in the sex trade business. Domestic human trafficking in Canada, the average age, and there are 3 triangles with Edmonton at the center of domestic human trafficking, and the average age, and we are the ones who are being domestically trafficked between provinces. And the average age of a trafficked child in the Indigenous community is between 7 and 12 years old. And so, you see that young Native prostitute on the street and you think that she has somehow chosen that. No, it's like 99.9% chance that she's being trafficked. And we have to pay attention to that. So again, it was them that taught me, where we're missing the cue, where we're missing it. They even schools that have a high population of Indigenous children, they will surround like vultures. You know, they even surround our reserves in our communities, you know, pimps and drug pushers waiting for, because of the oil money that we used to get. And when a kid turned 18, they would receive their oil money and they were just waiting to pounce on them, you know, like vultures. And in the same with the schools, if it has a high population of Indigenous children, there will be pimps and drug addicts surrounding it. Very unusual story came that parents, they complained to the school. They said, well, unless we see and catch something on the school property, there's nothing that we can do about it. So they went to the school board and they said the same thing. You know, unless we catch it on school property, there isn't anything that we can do about it. Or if you have names or if you know any of these people. So they went to the police and they got the same thing. I mean, they would have cars cruising the school every once in a while, but they didn't know when things were happening. So what happened was that the women of the community, they took their lawn chairs, they got their aunties, they got their sisters, they got everyone out there, and they sat every single day around the school. They just sat there every day. And so when any of those children looked out the window, they saw their mothers and their grandmothers and their aunties and their older sisters sitting there guarding them, that nobody was going to break that circle. Nobody was going to penetrate them. It took them a while. It took them about 2 months, but they won. Their school was then thereafter left alone. And I think the district was called something like Carmel or Carmen, something like that in Vancouver, where this is where that happened. Hard lessons to learn, that it's not just about what we're facing as adults or as young people, but what our children face as well. And that's a pretty harsh reality.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, why do you think it's important to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? That's coming up in December 10th of 2023.
Because it reminds us that we still have a lot of work to do. It reminds us that there are still things that can unite people. I don't know exactly what it means to Indigenous people, you know, because since then we've had things like the TRC. So how much effect has it had? We've had things like the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. And maybe it was because that Human Rights Declaration existed at all that the TRC and UNDRIP exist, and it calls attention more. I mean, all of our rights are supposed to be recognized under treaty, you know, and it's been so defiled and so corruptly interpreted by the Canadian government, with whom we did not sign treaty. And we signed treaty with the British government, and the British government illegally gave stewardship of the treaties to the Canadian government. So I think that it is in celebrations like this that unite us, but also remind us how much more work we have. It's like the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s. I mean, while they were out celebrating the liberation of their womanhood, there's people like my mother who was cleaning their houses and looking after their children. I mean, that's a common thing now that we find out about these things that supposedly are supposed to liberate all, but they don't really touch us until many decades later. And it's mostly because we've done all the work, you know, to do it. And I think it goes right back to, you only have the right to exercise. So I think in celebrating the United Nations Human Rights Commemoration, I believe that you have to do the work. You have to do the work yourself. You have to do the work with your family. And we have to just keep busting down doors. Then we get to celebrate. Then we get to really find out who the world is and who our neighbor is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, what do you feel needs to happen to right relations and build a just Canada?
Isn't that the $1,000,000 question? Yeah. It has everything to do with relationships. Everything to do with relationships. I mean, one of the reasons why people call me Nôhkom, as the elder in residence at the Edmonton Public Library, is that it puts us in immediate kinship. We are immediately related. Nôhkom means my grandmother. You probably heard the word kokum as well. Kokum means your grandmother. Nôhkom means my grandmother. So everyone at the library comes into the library, they call me Nôhkom. So that means that we are in relationship. It means that no child exists who doesn't have a grandmother. That's the way our culture is. No one goes without a mother. No one goes without a grandparent. I'm a chapan. I'm a great grandmother. And I don't dye my hair. I have good genes. I have 6 daughters. They all have more gray hair than I do. Even my beautiful young coworker that I work with, Emily, she has more gray hair than I do. Just good genes. But anyways, it's all about relationships. It's all about really, truly getting to know one another. How do I think? How do I see the world? How do you see the world? And we may not agree in all, but there's so much that our culture gives us, that it has. Oh, the noise is coming here. My granddaughter, she's got her computer on and is just always going like that. I should have asked them to turn it out. Very sorry about that. But what it does, and I tell people this, every single word, every single traditional practice, every single ceremony, every single prayer, the whole culture leads you to one goal. That's kindness and compassion. We don't have one practice that leads you how to hate another person. We don't have one ceremony that leads you to how to oppress another people. It is all about kindness and compassion. And our old people say, if you ever achieve anything in this world, if it's just kindness and compassion, you will have achieved everything. And that's what the culture is about. And the power of that, knowing that, learning it, and understanding how to practice that. I mean, and what are kindness and compassion? They are the acts of love. That's how powerful they are. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just reading some of the. I'm just reading some of the chat. Did you want me to read them later? I just thought in case somebody had a question. Did you have another question, Miriam?
Yeah, I got one last question.
Okay.
Yeah, like what is your last call to action to Canadians?
I think the worst thing that colonialism ever did was to denigrate and to almost destroy the matriarchal societies of Indigenous peoples. And that's the government by women. Like I say, you are what your mother is. We inherit from our mothers. If you were ever wanted to know every question, if you're Indigenous, about what you are what your mother is. I don't know about non-Indigenous people, but every Indigenous nation, First Nation in the world are matriarchal societies. And it's women who made the public agenda, and it's women who decided on the decision-making processes. And we come from an indestructible form of government, and it's called consensus, where everyone must agree. Everyone must agree. And it takes a long time to come to consensus, but everyone has a voice. Everyone has an equal voice. Too many people think that sameness is equality. Well, I treat everybody the same. That's not equality. If you you can't define it as sameness. And with our people, it was the opposite of sameness. It was equality, meeting everyone's needs, everyone's wants, and giving everyone a voice and respect to have that, and then to contribute to the decisions of the government that we had. I'll give you just a little, for instance, government under women is, the philosophy is win-win. And the exercise of that is, I am always right. And if I am always right, what are you? You are always right. Like, we can take this one thing, give our voice, our understanding of what this is. And I probably have the most unique perspective of anyone here. It doesn't mean I'm wrong. I am right in what I see. You are right in what you see. And you come around and you see my perspective. You are right again. I see your what you're seeing now, and I am right again. So we've completely lost any concept about that consensus government building. It's about creating healthy human relationships. It actually boosts our immune system to be able to speak openly and honestly with one another. So I think that we have lost so much. We know what has happened to the world when men think that they control it. We know what happens to women and children when men think that they control it, and that they denigrated that role of Indigenous women to bring that to the world. That I think that we've lost a lot. We don't even know what we've lost because we've lost so much. The other thing is the diversity in our societies of gender. We believe that there are 8 different genders, and we have lost so much that we can't even recognize a gender different from ourselves because we don't have that ability anymore. And that they bring such a profound perspective of the world and of the universe to it. We are sitting in ruts that we don't even know that we're in because we don't have the benefit of expanding that kind of knowledge and that kind of perspective into our world. So I think that those are the calls to action that we have to take. Women and gender. And we have to understand them. We have to understand them in a way that they get what they need to have from birth, from the very conception that they get those things, and to allow other cultures to be able to contribute to the wealth of knowledge and practice that we have in the society now. So those are my calls to action.